The German U-boats, on the symbols of terror beneath the surface, lie abandoned and forgotten across the seas. After they were ended, their fates were sealed, but their legacy still lingers. What happened to these machines of war? How did the world move on from these silent giants, on the so central to the conflict? Their on the 4 silhouettes now rust away in forgotten harbors and submerged in the deep, their stories buried under the weight of time. The end of the war marked the start of their transformation from deadly instruments of power to haunting relics, left behind by the tides of history. The war had ended, but the ocean remained filled with the ghosts of its violent past. The German U-boats, silent, haunting behemoths of steel and shadow, lay scattered across the seas, their deadly purpose fulfilled. Yet, despite the end of hostilities in 1945, the fate of these war machines was far from settled. Hundreds of these submarines, once symbols of terror beneath the waves, had outlived their military utility. What became of them after the war? How did the Allies and the Germans themselves deal with the monstrous remnants of their underwater arsenal? The immediate aftermath of World War II left Europe in a state of unprecedented devastation. Economies were shattered, borders were redrawn, and entire industries lay in ruins. Among the many tasks confronting the victors was the dismantling of the war machines that had ravaged the continent. Germany's U-boat fleet, once numbering over 1,000 at its peak, was one of the most potent instruments of war ever designed. The Allies now faced the challenge of managing this overwhelming surplus of lethal equipment. The decision to scrap the submarines was not immediate. The war had left nations in a state of both physical and mental exhaustion. There was no time for indulgence in ideologies or emotional reflection. The focus was on survival. In the immediate months following Germany's surrender, U-boats were seen as little more than symbols of a dark, recent history. They were too numerous, too expensive to maintain, and too obsolete in the face of new technologies. The Cold War loomed on the horizon, and the focus was rapidly shifting towards the development of new military tools that could ensure security in a world of shifting alliances. At first, many of the U-boats simply sat idle in ports or naval bases, awaiting decisions that seemed uncertain. Allied forces, particularly the British and Americans, struggled with the overwhelming numbers. The British, who had once been the victims of U-boat attacks, found themselves tasked with determining what to do with them. The sheer scale of the problem was daunting. There were over 1,100 German U-boats scattered across Europe, from Norway's icy shores to the Mediterranean Sea. The initial plan was to divide the fleet among the Allies, but logistical issues quickly turned this into a nightmare. The Germans themselves faced an even more complex situation. With the war's end, their navy, the Kriegsmarine, had all but ceased to exist. Submarines that had once been the pinnacle of German military might now lay abandoned in ports like Wilhelmshaven or Kiel, with little hope of reuse. The German High Command had ordered the scuttling of many U-boats before surrender, but still, hundreds remained intact. Their crews were either imprisoned or sent home, and the submarines were left behind, their futures uncertain. In the first months following the war, some of the U-boats were used in an attempt to salvage what remained of German naval power. A handful were taken by the victorious nations for analysis and testing. The United States, eager to understand the technological advances behind the U-boat's stealth and firepower, took several for research. Similarly, the Soviet Union, keen on improving its own naval capabilities, acquired a number of the submarines. These few became the subjects of extensive examination, their designs studied for any advantage that could be gained in the emerging Cold War arms race. But most of the U-boats did not meet such a fate. The vast majority were abandoned to the elements, their hulking shapes slowly deteriorating in the saltwater and rust. While the submarines that were not directly scuttled were left in harbor or scattered along the coastline, the majority were stripped of valuable parts, engines, steel, electronics, and any usable materials that could be repurposed for other industrial uses. There was little thought of preserving the technological marvels for posterity. Instead, the focus was on scrapping them quickly to free up space and resources. The disposal process itself was not without its own set of challenges. The infrastructure necessary to scrap such massive machines was limited, and many of the harbors and shipyards had suffered severe wartime damage. What could not be salvaged or reused was abandoned to deteriorate. Some U-boats were scuttled outright, sunk deliberately in open waters in a grim testament to their former purpose. The oceans themselves, having witnessed so much destruction, were now tasked with swallowing their remains. By the late 1940s, a more systematic process of U-boat disposal began. The Allies had initiated agreements among themselves on how to handle the German fleet. The British began the work of clearing out the naval bases along the North Sea. The German U-boats that were too far gone for repurposing or analysis were to be disposed of in an organized fashion. The process was slow, methodical, and frequently hampered by bureaucratic delay and a lack of available resources. Yet, even as the U-boats were scrapped, there remained a deeper issue that was never fully addressed: the psychological impact of the war machines. To many, the submarines were not just physical vessels. They were symbols of an entire world order that had been shattered. The silence of these boats, once feared for their destructive power, now echoed with a strange finality. To see them laid bare, rusting and useless, was to witness the death of a certain era. The U-boat fleet, so central to the war, would now become a casualty of the very post-war order it had helped shape. The larger context of the Cold War would soon render the U-boats obsolete in ways the Germans could not have foreseen. New weapons systems, new threats, and new ideologies began to dominate the focus of the world's great powers. The U-boats, in the end, were swept away by the tides of history, their technological legacy fading into obscurity. As the 1950s began, only a handful of U-boats would remain in operational service, mostly used for training or as targets for naval exercises. Others were converted into museums, relics of a bygone era, reminders of a war that had left the world deeply scarred. In Germany, the legacy of the U-boat fleet became a footnote in the broader narrative of the war's aftermath. The men who had once crewed them now found themselves grappling with the collapse of an entire society. Those who survived the war and the subsequent years would carry with them the haunting memories of their time beneath the waves. But for the submarines themselves, their fate was sealed. Slowly but surely, the U-boats vanished, their once feared silhouettes giving way to the more complex and insidious machines of the future. What remained were only the stories of men who had ventured deep into enemy waters, who had lived with the constant knowledge of death, and who now faced the challenge of moving beyond their own troubled pasts. The fate of the German U-boats was far from over. By the 1950s, the wreckage of these once feared machines had become part of a larger, complex picture. The remnants of their steel hulls dotted harbors across Europe, some submerged in the icy waters off the coast of Norway, others left to slowly rot in naval yards. The initial decisions on how to dispose of them had given way to more formal processes. The Allies, primarily Britain and the United States, now faced the daunting challenge of fully eliminating the U-boats from the collective memory of the war. In the aftermath of the war, the scrapping of warships was not just a matter of clearing space. The economic pressure was immense, and in many ways, the disposition of the U-boats reflected the shifting priorities of the post-war world. The immediate needs were financial. Europe's infrastructure was in shambles, and the cost of maintaining an obsolete fleet was simply too great. The U-boats were viewed as an economic burden, weighing down the nascent recovery efforts. Their steel could be melted down and repurposed for civilian use. Their engines, controls, and other components could be salvaged for the rebuilding of vital industries. The U-boats, like so many other remnants of the war, had become material to be recycled, to be transformed into something new. However, this process of repurposing was not straightforward. The scrap yards that would ultimately be tasked with dismantling these formidable vessels were already overwhelmed with the sheer volume of war debris. In many countries, industrial capacities had been devastated by years of bombardment. Ports that had been used for shipbuilding and military operations were now the site of recovery, sorting, and disposal. The logistical difficulties were compounded by the fact that many of the U-boats were spread across vast stretches of land and sea. Getting them from naval yards to the scrap heap was a monumental task in itself. In Britain, for instance, a significant number of U-boats were taken to shipbreaking yards. Some were transported to places like Foslane along the River Clyde in Scotland, where large-scale operations for dismantling military vessels had already begun. The process of scrapping a U-boat involved breaking it down in stages. First, the internal components would be stripped away: fuel tanks, mechanical parts, electronics, followed by cutting apart the outer hull. Each section was painstakingly removed, and the materials were sent to be melted down or repurposed. For the workers involved in these operations, it was a strange juxtaposition: dismantling machines that had once held such fear and power, now reduced to nothing more than piles of scrap metal. The United States, similarly, took an interest in the U-boat fleet, though its approach was more scientific. The U.S. Navy was eager to learn what it could from the German technology, particularly the innovative use of sonar and torpedo systems. Several U-boats were taken to American shores for study, where they were dissected and analyzed by military engineers. In the early post-war years, U-boats provided invaluable insight into German engineering, particularly their advanced construction techniques and their stealth capabilities. However, despite the wealth of knowledge these submarines offered, the United States quickly moved beyond them. The Cold War demanded a new type of naval warfare, and the German U-boat, once an embodiment of silent terror, had no place in the future. In both Britain and the United States, the U-boats that were not sent for technical analysis were swiftly dismantled. But even as the process of scrapping continued, some of the submarines remained remarkably intact, preserved in the water or hidden from view in forgotten harbors. These U-boats became a symbol of loss, not just of military power, but of a world order that had been erased by the war. They lingered as eerie reminders of the past, their surfaces rusting but their memories, to some, still sharp. The fate of the U-boats in the Soviet Union was equally complex. The Soviet Union, having suffered devastating losses during the war, was not as concerned with scrapping the U-boats for resources, but rather with assessing them for any potential military advantages. In the immediate post-war years, the Soviets took possession of several German submarines, including some of the more advanced models. These vessels were brought to Soviet shipyards and examined in great detail. Soviet engineers studied the design and construction of the U-boats in an effort to replicate their innovations in their own naval fleet. But by the early 1950s, even the Soviets lost interest in the U-boats. The development of nuclear-powered submarines rendered the German designs obsolete. Just as the United States had moved on from the old U-boat technology, so too did the Soviet Union. The few remaining German submarines in Soviet hands were decommissioned, stripped for parts, and abandoned. The U-boat, once a source of pride for the Kriegsmarine, now held little value in the face of emerging technologies. Yet, not all of the German U-boats disappeared so easily. As the Cold War intensified, the symbolism of these vessels began to change. Some were converted into training platforms, used by navies in various countries to teach new generations of sailors how to handle submarines. The U-boats became valuable not for their military function, but for their educational purpose. Countries like France, Italy, and even the United States repurposed old German submarines, using them to train crews in the complexities of undersea warfare. The significance of these U-boats shifted from being instruments of destruction to tools for instruction. In Germany, however, the situation was different. After the war, the nation was divided into East and West, and the remnants of the Kriegsmarine were largely forgotten by the government. The new German states had little interest in revisiting the dark legacy of the submarines. West Germany, rebuilding its economy and its military in the context of NATO, had no desire to be associated with the symbols of its wartime past. The East German government, under Soviet influence, had its own agenda and chose not to highlight the U-boat fleet as part of its national narrative. Nonetheless, remnants of the U-boat fleet continued to haunt the German consciousness. Some submarines were preserved in museums, placed on display as monuments to the country's wartime past. In these quiet exhibitions, they became historical relics, objects of fascination for a new generation of Germans who had no direct memory of the war. These preserved U-boats became mute witnesses to the past, sitting in silence as symbols of a time long gone. But for the most part, the U-boats were dismantled, abandoned, or sunk to the depths of the sea. The vast majority were consumed by time and nature. It is estimated that only a small fraction of the original U-boat fleet survived in any form. Some lie in the cold waters off the coast of Norway, their hulls shattered and corroded. Others are buried deep beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, a silent memorial to their once feared presence. By the 1960s, the final vestiges of the U-boat fleet had been wiped away. What had been a force capable of crippling entire naval fleets was now reduced to little more than a footnote in the annals of history. The submarines, once feared and revered, had become obsolete. The world had moved on, and so too had the story of the German U-boat. The consequences of this industrial destruction are still felt today. As the U-boats faded into history, they left behind a complicated legacy. Their technological innovations had been both a marvel and a curse, transforming naval warfare forever. They had once symbolized Germany's desperate attempt to fight a losing war, and in the end, they were forgotten, abandoned to the whims of history. But the scars they left on the surface of the ocean and in the memories of those who lived through their terror remain. There is something almost tragic about the way these magnificent machines were discarded. The U-boats, like so many other symbols of wartime power, vanished into history, leaving only echoes of their presence in the cold depths of the sea. What remains today is a world that has, in many ways, forgotten the German U-boats, their legacy a quiet reminder of the immense costs of war, both seen and unseen. But the oceans still hold their secrets, and in the rusting hulls and abandoned harbors, the ghosts of the U-boats wait, enduring long after the war that gave them life. The legacy of the German U-boats after World War II is a reminder of the ephemeral nature of military power. They were once mighty, feared across the seas, but in the end, they were no match for the relentless march of history.